Hello everyone. I'm assuming that those of you listening or watching have been through some kind of formal schooling. Looking back at your experience, you've probably had to work in groups. Because as you may know, it is well established that students learn a lot when interacting with their peers. You might have also gone on a field trip to help you better understand the lessons you've been taught, like going to the forest when learning about different ecosystems. But then, COVID-19 came along and threw away everything we knew as best practice in education. This is, however, not the first time an interruption to education has happened. It has happened before in different individual countries due to natural disasters, protests, war, and other reasons. But this is the first time an interruption to education happens globally, and without being able to predict when the interruption will be over. Ministers of education, educators, researchers, students, parents, and the public worldwide looked at each other and said, well, but now what? But there it was, the magical solution: distance learning. It might have been the only way for education systems to demonstrate resilience. Many were skeptical about it at first. Russians, for example, were not sure about its effectiveness. It is suggested, however, that we must not use the term distance learning to explain what education systems did during the pandemic, but instead use emergency remote education, because systems adopted this approach in order to survive with minimal losses possible. You see, this is an important realization. Education systems were not aiming for ideal education delivery, but rather they switched to survival mode. Now that educators know that emergency remote education is the way to move forward without interrupting education delivery for God knows how long, education systems worldwide have to figure out how they'll implement emergency remote education. The easiest way might have been online websites and apps with content available for self-learning and where virtual sessions take place. But we're not talking about a group of students, or a school, or even a group of schools or universities, where you can track the needs of students and respond accordingly. We're talking about nations moving from face-to-face to online learning almost overnight, with all the diversities present among its citizens, economically, socially, culturally, etc. According to UNICEF, out of the 127 countries with data, 5 methods were used for emergency remote education: apps and websites for live sessions or self-learning, TV programs, radio stations, and paper-based responses with take-home packages. In most cases, countries adopted more than one approach to cater for the needs of all students from different socioeconomic backgrounds. South Korea, for instance, provided 3 options for schools to choose 2 or more from: synchronous interactive classes where students go online at a specific time to attend a class, asynchronous content-based classes where the content is made available to students to go through at their own convenience, or independent assignments, where students are provided with tasks to complete independently. Some issues, however, were raised because of emergency remote education, and countries responded quite differently to these issues. I'll talk about 4 of these issues. 1, the digital divide. The problem is not new, but the pandemic broadened the gap and highlighted the inequalities that were present long before the era of COVID-19. Not every student in the world has access to the internet, TV, radio, or even electricity. Governments responded differently to this issue. Turkey, China, and India were among the countries that subsidized the internet to students who need it. On the other hand, in addition to subsidizing the internet connection, the government in South Korea provided rental devices to students in need. Another approach was providing students with radios, as in Burkina Faso, or using telephone connections to deliver tasks to students, as was done in Russia. 2. Trauma, psychological pressure, and anxiety. The pandemic and the lockdown were pressuring to all of us, of all age groups, though to different degrees. The education systems should have taken this into consideration. Some systems did. For instance, in China, the government established counseling services to students, as well as a hotline that residents can call for psychological support, and provided services to help fresh graduates find jobs. On the other hand, emergency remote education applied in Saudi Arabia relied heavily on students' motivation, their self-learning skills, and their parents' involvement by providing mainly asynchronous content. This added to the heavy psychological, social, and emotional impact of the pandemic on the parents and the students. This brings us to the third issue, the emerging educational roles of parents. Parents suddenly found themselves responsible for their children's education. In some countries, such as Saudi Arabia, the parental role was essential, which not only was a heavy burden on students and their parents, but also increased the inequalities between students depending on the availability of their parents and whether or not they have full-time jobs of their own, as well as their level of education and readiness to tutor. This was also the reason that set unique challenges for households with multiple children in Egypt. The last issue is that unique basic soft and technical skills were necessary to survive in a time of crisis. I remember spending the first 15 minutes of a session waiting for the professor to call the IT department because she couldn't log in. Believe me, nobody knows the need for these skills during the pandemic better than the IT people at every institution. Teachers and students were suddenly in need to gain skills related to the use of technology to continue teaching and learning during the pandemic. Japan, for instance, a country widely known for its technology and advancement, lagged introducing technology into schools and universities, and thus its teachers and students lacked the essential skills to survive during the pandemic, which led the government to postpone the beginning of the new academic year, which usually starts in April, instead of implementing emergency remote education. It is worth noting here that remote learning should not be face-to-face learning done online. Although a lot of countries reported facing this challenge, I'll give the example of India and Russia, where teachers kept on teaching the same way as they did prior to the pandemic, but instead of standing in the classroom in front of the students, they were now sitting in front of a computer. This is what happened during the pandemic. What happens afterwards? What will the post-COVID education system look like? What are the lessons learned that will help systems become more resilient? First of all, we can't really tell the effects of the approaches that the education systems adopted during the pandemic on students' education just yet. This is an analysis that has to wait a bit longer. As for whether education systems will change after the pandemic is over, here's what we hope happens. 1. Not back to business as usual. The pandemic forced education systems to take steps into the virtual world, which would have otherwise taken so much time. We don't expect schools and universities to turn 100% virtual, as is the case currently, but it is expected that blended learning approaches to education will be adopted, and more online learning approaches would be implemented. 2. A very important lesson to take from the pandemic is that we must fix the systems in favor of those who have been facing injustice within the education system prior to COVID-19 pandemic. Systems should invest to reach marginalized and vulnerable children. As previously mentioned, the issue of inequality was pre-existing in the system, and it was only highlighted during the pandemic. In simple words, the system should now resolve this issue. They should invest in the infrastructure of remote and rural areas. They must provide equal access and support to students. 3. Each education system should look at its own experience to enhance its curriculum, teacher training, structure, or other aspects of education. For instance, because the curriculum in Egypt was highly dependent on rote memorization, students and teachers found it hard to shift to research and project-based learning during the pandemic. How will education systems prepare for possible upcoming interruptions in the systems? The response to the pandemic was different in different countries and societies, but perhaps the most important lesson here is for systems to create a plan B. Because this is what resilient systems look like. They have the resources and the knowledge that help them survive when facing challenges. And maybe after all this is over, we can give parents a well-needed break and get students to sleep in schools for a couple of days, weeks maybe. Thank you.